Okay, so just to finish off the disadvantages then, so we're discussing beforehand, weren't we, about you get these disproportionate results. So Conservatives 36% of the vote, or 37 really, but they won 51% of seats in the House of Commons. And the reason is like we were saying before, you could get a situation like in Cheltenham, couldn't you? You could have a situation where, let's say the Conservatives got 2,000 votes more than their nearest rival in every single seat in the country. They would win 650 seats, and no one else would win any, despite the fact they came second in every single seat in the country. That's obviously, exaggerating the point, but you can see how that situation occurs. It doesn't need a huge number of seats for the Conservatives or Labour or whoever just to gain a few thousand votes more than their nearest rival. If they do that in a repeated number of seats, you can see how they win a lot more seats despite not getting that many more votes. And that's what happens here. And what First Past the Post does, it favours parties who gain a lot of votes in a number of seats. So, for example, if you're winning a number of seats by, like 1,000 votes or more, then obviously you're going to win those seats. But if you come second or third with fairly high percent of the vote, then you're not going to win any of them. And this is what happened to UKIP. So UKIP, for example, they got 12% of the vote. They came second or third in a lot of seats, but their vote wasn't deep enough to win any of those seats apart from one. They'd almost have been better off if they could have got their 12% of the vote to be concentrated in one area. They would have won a lot more seats, which is why the Scottish National Party does well. Obviously, across the country, they only get 4% of the vote, but that 4.7% of the vote is all within Scotland, where there's 59 seats. And so because of that, their vote is quite deep in Scotland, and they have enough to win seats. A bit like this one in Fife, for example. They only won it by 2 votes. But if they won every seat in Scotland by just 2 votes, they'd have 100% of seats in Scotland, despite the fact other parties would have come very close in terms of percent of the vote. So I hope that kind of makes sense. So one big point with First Past the Post is this business about it helps the big parties out, and small parties, apart from the SNP, normally suffer because the vote of small parties is normally quite spread out. The Greens, 850,000 votes, but only got 1 seat because the only place where they got enough votes in one place is in Brighton, not elsewhere. UKIP, the only place where they had enough votes in one place was in Clacton-on-Sea. Everywhere else it was spread out. Whereas for Labour and the Conservatives, they've got quite deep votes in quite a few areas. Countryside areas for the Conservatives and small towns, big cities for Labour. Okay, so I hope that kind of makes sense. It's just worth getting your head around that particular point. And as we said, no government has actually had half the vote since 1951. So, the Conservatives in 2015 on this graph, 37% of the vote, and they became the government because they got 51% of seats. I don't have the exact figures for 2019, but I think they got about 43-44% of the vote, did Boris Johnson, but he got, I don't know what the percentage, it must be about 65% of seats in the House of Commons, even greater than that, I suspect, because they won a lot of those seats in the north of England against Labour by just a small amount, 1,000 votes, 2,000 votes, things like that. But this system is a winner takes all. One more vote than your nearest rival, you win that seat. It doesn't matter that you don't get that majority, or absolute majority. Okay, and all this links into this point that this system is really unfair to small parties. As I said before, small parties' votes tend to be spread out. The Green vote, 850,000 people voted Green, but their vote is spread out quite thinly across the country, apart from in Brighton. Hence why there were no seats apart from in Brighton. I also think in many places, small parties probably suffer from tactical voting. So if you were like a Green voter in, say, Nuneaton, you might think, well, the election's going to be won in Nuneaton between Labour and the Conservatives. I think I'm more likely to vote Labour because I don't want the Conservatives to win, because at least Labour are a bit more Green than the Conservatives. So therefore I'm going to vote Labour. So I think some of the small parties will probably have more votes if there was a different voting system. I think quite a lot of their supporters tend to vote tactically. A bit like what happens to Lib Dems and, etc., etc. And the classic for showing what happens to small parties is UKIP in 2015. They got 12% of the vote across the entire country, which I think was the third highest vote. I think they came third after the Conservatives and Labour, yet they got 0.2% of seats in the House of Commons, i.e. 1. And this is the classic problem with first past the post. It really punishes small parties. Now, supporters of first past the post say this is great because if UKIP had been an extremist party, we'd have been thankful that the British National Party did not gain seats. But it's not particularly democratic. 12% of people basically wasted their vote by voting UKIP. 12% of people's voices are not being heard in Parliament. So it's really unfair to small parties, and therefore you might say is not a very democratic system. But supporters, their main argument is it leads to strong and stable governments. Most governments in this country have an absolute majority of seats in the House of Commons. There's therefore a very clear mandate, a very clear set of promises which they need to fill, and they can crack on and get on with it. The main argument against is it's unfair to small parties. Lots of people's voices aren't heard in Parliament. Therefore, we need to change the voting system so everyone's views can be equally represented. So they are the main arguments for and against first past the post. They are arguments which you need to know for the exam, and you need to have a rough idea, at the very least, on how the voting system operates and why it produces some of these difficulties regarding disproportionate results, etc., etc.